The morning I found a line of industrial concrete barriers blocking the mouth of my own driveway for the fourth time in 10 days. I didn't scream, didn't throw my coffee, and I didn't call the police. Instead, I just stood there in the freezing Montana wind, watched the steam rise from my mug, and dialed a number I hadn't called in 15 years. When a gravelly voice picked up on the second ring, I only said 5 words, and quote, "I need something permanently immovable," and quote. Because that was the moment I stopped being a polite neighbor and started being the logistics officer I'd been for 2 decades in the sandbox. And little did Brenda Vance know, she just invited a literal fortress into her pristine picket fence kingdom. See, most people look at a suburban HOA president like some minor annoyance, like a mosquito you can just swat away, but when you've spent half your life moving heavy artillery and tanks across hostile territory, you learn to spot a tyrant from a mile away. And Brenda Vance was a textbook dictator in a designer blazer who thought her clipboard gave her the divine right of kings. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 54 years old, and after 20 years of service and a divorce that felt like losing a limb, all I wanted was a quiet corner lot in Ponderosa Ridge where I could run my custom furniture business and grow some decent tomatoes. But Brenda had other plans for my peace of mind. It all started on a Tuesday in late September, right when the air gets that sharp metallic bite of an incoming mountain winter, and I was out on my driveway unloading a shipment of reclaimed black walnut from my old Ford F-250, a truck that seen more dirt than a gravedigger and has the dents to prove it. I was just about to haul the last slab into my garage workshop when I felt that prickly sensation on the back of my neck, that feeling of being watched, and I turned around to see Brenda Vance standing at the edge of my property, clutching a tablet like it was a holy relic and wearing a smile that didn't oppose. T quite reach her eyes. She didn't oppose. T say hello. She didn't oppose. T asked how my morning was. She just tapped a manicured fingernail against the screen and told me that commercial vehicles over 3 tons were prohibited for being stationary in private driveways for more than 2 hours. And then she looked at my truck like it was a pile of hot garbage sitting on a silk rug. I tried to stay civil. I really did, telling her it was my personal vehicle and I was just unloading supplies for a hobby. But she just tilted her head, let out this little condescending hum, and informed me that, in quote, commercial-grade activity, in quote, was a violation of the aesthetic harmony they'd worked so hard to maintain at Ponderosa Ridge. 3 days later, I got my first, in quote, love letter, in quote, from the board, a $100 fine for an unauthorized commercial vehicle, and a, in quote, formal warning, in quote, about operating a business out of a residential zone, even though my furniture work was purely bespoke and I rarely had more than 1 visitor a month. I spent that weekend buried in the HOA bylaws, reading through 50 pages of fine print until my eyes blurred, and what I found was a masterpiece of vague, weaponized bureaucracy that Brenda had clearly spent years refining to suit her whims. There was nothing specifically banning my truck, but there was a clause about, in quote, visual nuisances, in quote, that was wide enough to drive a semi-truck through, and Brenda was using it like a scalpel to prune away anyone she didn't oppose. T deem, in quote, ridge material, in quote. I paid the fine, mostly because I didn't oppose. T won the headache, but that was my first mistake because bullies don't oppose. T see a payment as a settlement. They see it as blood in the water, and Brenda was a shark who hadn't oppose. T fed. In a long time. By October, the harassment turned into a full-blown siege, with Brenda driving her white Range Rover past my house at 6 in the morning and 10 at night, taking photos of my trash cans if they were out 5 minutes past pickup, or measuring the height of my grass with a literal yardstick. But the real escalation happened when she convinced the board to install, in quote, temporary safety bollards, in quote, along the easement of my corner lot, claiming they were necessary to prevent, in quote, heavy commercial traffic, in quote, from eroding the curb. But in reality, she positioned them so I had to make a 20-point turn just to get into my own garage. That's when I met Arthur, my neighbor from 2 doors down, a retired civil litigator who looked like a grumpy owl and spent most of his time pruning roses with the intensity of a surgeon. He walked over one evening while I was struggling to back my truck in, watched me for a minute, and told me that Brenda had done the same thing to the family who lived here before me. Harassed them until they sold the house for 20% under market value just to escape her. Arthur told me about the, end quote, Vance tax, end quote, which was basically her system of selective fines used to fund her pet landscaping projects, while she let her own backyard fountain violate every water restriction in the county. And as I sat there listening to him, my blood started to simmer with a kind of cold, calculated rage I hadn't in Oppos felt since my days in the service. The breaking point came in November, a week before Thanksgiving, when I woke up to find my truck missing from my driveway. Not stolen, but towed by a company 2 towns over on Brenda and Oppos, as personal orders because I hadn't, quote, encroached, in quote, on the easement she'd illegally narrowed with her bollards. It cost me $400 to get my truck back, money that was supposed to go toward a new bandsaw, and when I stood in that gravel impound lot, smelling the diesel and the grease, something in me just clicked into place. I realized I'd been playing her game, trying to follow her rules in her court, but Brenda Vance wasn't in Oppos. A leader, she was a logistics problem, and I was a man who specialized in solving logistics problems with overwhelming force. I didn't in Oppos. Go home and yell at her. I didn't in Oppos. Sent an angry email to the board. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with a pot of black coffee and started a new file on my laptop titled, in quote, Structural Integrity, end quote. And then I called my old sergeant, Miller, who now ran a high-end architectural concrete firm in Missoula. End quote. Miller, end quote. I said, watching Brenda and Oppos' Range Rover crawl past my house on the security feed I'd just installed, end quote. I need 4 decorative planters. But I don't in Oppos. Want them made of clay or wood. I want them reinforced with grade 60 rebar, poured with 5,000 psi high-strength concrete, and I want them anchored 6 feet into the Montana clay. End quote. Miller laughed, the kind of deep, knowing laugh of a man who's built bunkers in bad places, and he asked me if I was expecting a mortar strike or just a very angry neighbor. I told him it was a bit of both. And for the next 3 weeks, while Brenda thought she had me beat and I played the role of the defeated, quiet neighbor, Miller and I worked on the blueprints for what I like to call the, end quote, Great Wall of Ponderosa. End quote. The genius of the plan was in the math. The HOA bylaws restricted, end quote, fences and walls, end quote, over 4 feet. But there was a specific exemption for, end quote, movable decorative landscaping features, end quote, like planters and urns, provided they didn't in Oppos exceed 36 inches in height. Brenda had written that rule herself so she could have those massive, ugly stone pots in her own yard. I was about to use her own vanity to bury her. We waited for the perfect window, which came when Brenda announced she was taking a 10-day luxury cruise to the Caribbean, leaving her, end quote, lieutenants, end quote, on the board to watch the neighborhood in her absence. The day after her flight took off, Miller's crew arrived at 5 a.m. with 2 cement mixers and a crane that looked like it belonged on a skyscraper project. And while the rest of the neighborhood was sleeping, we began the silent, professional work of fortifying my property line. We didn't in Oppos. Just placed these planters. We engineered them, digging 4 massive holes along the edge of my driveway, right where Brenda liked to put her, end quote, temporary, end quote, barriers, and we poured the footings deep and wide, weaving a cage of steel rebar that would have made a bridge engineer proud. Each planter was 3 feet tall, 6 feet long, and 4 feet deep, finished with a beautiful, dark slate aggregate that matched the mountain aesthetic perfectly. But once they were filled with wet concrete and capped with 2 tons of topsoil and winter-hardy evergreens, each one weighed a staggering 4,000 pounds. By the time the sun came up on Monday morning, I had 16,000 pounds of immovable justice sitting exactly 1 inch inside my property line, positioned with such surgical precision that no Range Rover or tow truck could ever get close to my vehicle again. I spent that week planting expensive hardy shrubs and installing low-voltage LED lighting that made the whole thing look like a high-end museum installation. And when the other board members came by, scratching their heads and clutching their clipboards, I just smiled and handed them the architectural specs. End quote. It's just decorative landscaping, end quote. I told them my voice is smooth as polished marble, end quote, perfectly within the height restrictions of Article 4, Section 2, and since they aren't in Oppos, technically in Oppos, attached in Oppos, to the house they don in Oppos, qualify as a permanent structure under the city code, end quote. They couldn't in Oppos, do a thing, because Miller had signed off on the engineering and Arthur, My lawyer neighbor had already drafted a preemptive brief stating that any attempt to remove them would be considered a violation of my private property rights and a felony act of destruction. The real show started the following Monday, the day Brenda returned from her cruise, and I made sure to be sitting on my porch with a fresh mug of coffee when her Range Rover turned the corner. I watched her slow down, then stop, then literally lurch forward as she saw the four massive concrete sentinels guarding my driveway, their dark slate surfaces glinting in the morning sun like a taunt. She didn't into oppose, even park her car. She just left it idling in the middle of the street, slammed the door, and marched up my lawn with a face that was a terrifying shade of purple, her designer sunglasses perched on top of her head like a crown of thorns. End quote. What is this monstrosity, Elias? End quote. She shrieked, her voice cracking the morning quiet. End quote. You remove these industrial eyesores immediately, or I will have the city bulldoze them by noon. End quote. I just took a slow sip of coffee, let the warmth settle in my chest, and told her that they weren't into oppos, eyesores. They were, end quote, aesthetic enhancements, end quote, designed to prevent soil erosion from heavy vehicle traffic, a concern she'd so graciously brought to my attention the month before. She spent the next 4 hours on her phone, screaming at the city building inspector, the police, and her own lawyers, but one by one, the dominoes I'd spent weeks setting up began to fall on her face. The building inspector arrived, spent 20 minutes looking at the planters with a look of genuine impressed curiosity, and told her that since they were under 36 inches and didn't into oppos, interfere with the utility easement, he had no jurisdiction to move them. The police told her it was a civil matter and to stop blocking the road with her car. And when her own lawyer finally called her back, he had to give her the news that Miller and Arthur had already anticipated. The planters were legally, end quote, movable, end quote, property, even if you need a literal industrial crane to move them, which meant they didn't into oppos, violate the permanent structure covenants. Brenda was trapped, blocked by the very rules she'd written to trap others. And as she stood there in her driveway, looking at those 4 tons of concrete that she couldn't into oppos, move, couldn't into oppos, fine, and couldn't into oppos, ignore, I saw the first crack in her armor. The realization that for the first time in 10 years, she'd met someone who didn't into oppos, care about her clipboard. But I wasn't oppos, done yet, because a logistics officer knows that you dawn into oppos. Just stop the enemy's advance. Busting the supply lines is how you win the war, and while Brenda was busy obsessing over my planners, Arthur and I had been doing some deep-sea diving into the HOA's financial records. It turned out that for the last 3 years, Brenda had been, end quote, subsidizing, end quote, her Range Rover lease and her backyard fountain repairs by funneling, end quote, emergency maintenance fees, end quote, into a shell company owned by her brother-in-law, a small-time contractor who hadn't into oppos. Set foot in Ponderosa Ridge in a decade. We waited for the annual general meeting in December, a cold, snowy night where the community center smelled like damp coats and cheap cookies, and Brenda stood at the podium, looking tired but still trying to maintain that iron-fisted persona. She tried to open the meeting by proposing a new, end quote, landscaping surcharge, end quote, specifically aimed at my planters, but before she could even get through the first slide, Arthur stood up in the back of the room with a stack of bank statements and a smile that was sharper than any razor. The next hour was a masterpiece of professional destruction, as Arthur systematically laid out the evidence of Brenda's embezzlement, showing the paper trail from the HOA's, end quote, reserve fund, end quote, directly into her personal accounts, while the neighbors, people Brenda had bullied and fined for years, slowly turned their heads toward her with a look of collective, cold fury. She tried to deny it. She tried to scream about, end quote, fake records, end quote, and, end quote, harassment, end quote. But when the board's own treasurer broke down and admitted he'd been helping her cover it up out of fear, the game was over. The police were called, not by Brenda this time, but by the board, and as I watched her being led out of the community center in the middle of a Montana snowstorm, her designer coat draped over her shaking shoulders, I didn't in oppos, feel a surge of triumph or need to gloat. I just felt a quiet sense of balance restored, the kind of feeling you get when a heavy load is finally leveled and the tires are running smooth on a long, open road. Brenda ended up selling her house 6 months later to pay back the restitution and her legal fees, moving to some condo complex 2 counties away where I'm sure she's currently measuring someone's balcony plants. But Ponderosa Ridge changed after she left. The new board, led by Arthur and Eleanor, a sweet grandmother who actually knows how to talk to people, turned those, in quote, temporary bollards, in quote, into a community garden, and the atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted from a police state to an actual community. My planters are still there, of course. They aren't into oppos. Going anywhere for the next 100 years. But they don't into oppos. Look like fortresses anymore. They're covered in blooming mountain laurel and creeping phlox, and they become a bit of a local landmark, a reminder that you could be a good neighbor and still hold your ground. I still run my furniture business, and sometimes when I'm out there in the garage sanding down a piece of oak, I'll look at those 16,000 pounds of concrete and think about how much energy Brenda spent trying to control a world that didn't and oppos belong to her. It makes you wonder, though, about the, in quote, Brenda's, in quote. In your own life, the people who use a little bit of power to try and make themselves feel big by making everyone else feel small, and whether we're all just one concrete pour away from taking our peace back. Was I wrong to go to such extremes, to spend thousands of dollars and months of my life on a, in quote, spite project, in quote, that could have been solved with a lawsuit? Or is there a point where the only way to deal with a bully is to become an immovable object they can and oppose? Break. I see people in the comments all the time talking about how they just, in quote, roll over, in quote, and pay the fines because it's easier than fighting. But if everyone does that, aren't in oppos, we just building the tyrant in oppos as throne for them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to build your own, in quote, fortress, in quote, against a neighbor from hell? Or did I take the, in quote, army vet, in quote, thing a step too far by bringing 30,000 pounds of concrete to a suburban spat? Drop your own HOA horror stories below. Let's talk about where the line is between, in quote, keeping the peace, in quote, and, in quote, surrendering your soul, in quote. And if you enjoyed this little tale of Montana justice, hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more stories where the little guy finds a way to win. And trust me, they usually involve a lot of heavy lifting.